begin with the parsha in a nutshell, and we go from there. So, Mishpatim in a nutshell. Mishpatim means law, but it specifically means the laws, the logical laws, the civil law. Following the revelation at Sinai, God legislates a series of laws for the people of Israel. These include the laws of indentured servant, the penalties for murder, kidnapping, assault, and theft, civil laws pertaining to redress of damages, the granting of loans and the responsibilities of the four guardians, and the rules governing the conduct of justice by courts of law. So, a whole series of civil law. Also included are laws warning against mistreatment of foreigners, the observance of the seasonal festivals, and the agricultural gifts that are to be brought to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. The prohibition against cooking meat and milk, and the mitzvah of prayer. Altogether, the parsha of Mishpatim contains 53 mitzvot, 53 commandments, 23 imperative commandments, and 30 prohibitions. God promises to bring the people of Israel to the Holy Land and warns them against assuming the pagan ways of its current inhabitants. The people of Israel proclaim, "We will do and we will hear all that God commands us." Leaving Aaron and Hur in charge of the Israelite camp, Moses ascends Mount Sinai and remains there for 40 days and 40 nights to receive the Torah from God. So that is, I guess, the story in a nutshell. And now we want to think a little bit about what the parsha is telling us. But we begin from thinking about where is the parsha said? In other words, the location of the parsha. And the parsha appears right after the giving of the Torah. And it's actually sandwiched between the two stories of the giving of the Torah. The giving of the Torah was described in the end of last parsha, really the second half of last parsha. But then the last reading of this parsha, the Torah once again starts discussing Moshe preparing and ascending the mountain. Now there's the big debate between the classic commentators of when exactly the end of this week's parsha happened. When did Moshe climb the mountain? And we'll stick with Rashi. Rashi says that the end of this week's parsha describing Moshe preparing for the giving of the Torah it was out of order. It happened last week. It's just written later. So if that's the case, what happens is it turns out that the giving of the Torah, the civil law, is sandwiched in middle of the description of the giving of the Torah. So just to show you what I'm referring to, what I'm talking about, I'm going to share the screen, and we'll open up the final reading of this week's parsha. So you have 6 readings about the law, and then you get to the seventh reading. Seventh reading, Exodus chapter 24. So if you want to see it in the Stone edition, Exodus chapter 24, Stone edition is page 441. In any case, to Moses he said, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and prostrate yourselves from afar." You have the preparation. I'm jumping to verse number 3, and it says, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered in unison and said, "All the words that the Lord has spoken we will do." And then Moshe builds an altar. He slaughters an animal, a whole story, a revelation of God, verse 10, and they perceived the God of Israel, and beneath his feet was like the forming of a sapphire brick, and like the appearance of the heavens for clarity. Very interesting description we spoke about in the past, and maybe we'll get to it today. In any case, Moshe then says, it keeps going. It talks about, God says, "Come up, I'll give you the tablets." And then you have verse 15 and 16. You have a description of God once again descending on Mount Sinai. So it says, and Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days, and called to Moses on the 7th day from within the cloud. In any case, ultimately, and the appearances of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire atop of the mountain before the eyes of the children of Israel. And finally, the final verse of the parsha, and Moses came within the cloud, and he went up to the mountain, and Moses was upon the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Why am I reading this to you? Because at least according to Rashi, this story happens. This is the same story. It's just a different description as the description of the giving of a Torah, which we read last week. And what's happening here, so it turns out that in between the entire story of the story of the giving of the Torah, we have the whole body of the civil law. And this is also highlighted by the fact that Rashi himself, Rashi in the beginning of the parsha, the opening statement of the parsha is also interesting. We want it, in other words, also relevant to our discussion here. So I'm going to pull it open. The first verse of the parsha. Where are we? Here we go. So in the Stone edition, in the Chumash, it's on page 417. And the verse is, and these are the ordinances that you shall set before them. And these are the ordinances. Rashi comments on the letter Vav, which is and. And Rashi says that and is the connection to the previous. So let's read Rashi. These are the ordinances. Whenever it says these in the Torah, this word is used to separate from what has been stated previously. Where it says, and these, like in this case, so the vav, the and is a connector, it means that it is adding to what has been previously stated. This comes from Tanchuma, from the Medrash. Thus, just as what we have been previously stated, namely the 10 Commandments, were from Sinai, these two were from Sinai. So that's the first statement. Then we have another interpretation in Rashi, but that's the first statement. The first statement we say is that the reason why the Torah puts the civil law immediately after, or really sandwiched between the story of the giving of the Torah, because what the Torah wants to tell you is that the connection to God that we experienced at Sinai, the 10 Commandments, the revelation of God, is very important and very inspiring. But the civil law, in other words, how we apply those principles to our daily life, that is also, quote unquote, from Sinai. In other words, that's the purpose of Sinai. The purpose of Sinai is not to come and see the thunder and the lightning and hear the inspiring words of God. The purpose of Sinai is, how are you going to apply that to your interactions with other people in the mundane world? And that's why the Torah now connects the story of the civil law with the story of the giving of the Torah, because that is the place where you see that the values of the Torah are going to be expressed in the day-to-day life. And that's sort of the test. And as we will see in a moment, the first place where the Torah turns its attention to what matters of law, who are we trying to protect, right? There's big discussions when people write the law, which class of people are being protected. But in any case, when the Torah is beginning with the civil law, as we will see, the first part of the population that the Torah is addressing is the protecting of the right of the servant. So that's very interesting. In other words, how we treat people, and more importantly, how we treat the people who are the least powerful in society, is really the expression of Sinai, of the values that we received when we got the Torah. So that's just by way of introduction. Now I just want to say something about the 3 categories of commandments, because the Torah starts and says, Ve'ela ha-mishpatim. These are the ordinances, and the sages explain that mishpatim means the mitzvot, the commandments that are logical. And then there's 2 other categories. There's the category of edut, testimonials, which are the things we do to commemorate the past events. For example, Shabbat, which commemorates the creation of the world, or holidays, which commemorate historic events, the Exodus from Sinai, etc., the Exodus from Egypt and the revelation at Sinai. That's in the second category called Edut, testimonials. And then there's the Chukim, the decrees that do not have any reason, at least not a reason that we know. We don't do it because of the reason, we do it because God told us to do it. And it's interesting that this week's parsha, even though it's called Mishpatim, it's called Mishpatim, the ordinances, which is the law that is logical, because that's the predominant part of the parsha. But this parsha does include all three categories of commandments, because in this parsha you also have, for example, the mitzvot of the holidays, which is the testimonials, and you also have some mitzvot that are decrees that are understood to be mitzvot that we don't do because of any reason. For example, the mitzvah of milk and meat, not to cook, not to mix milk and meat or cook with milk and meat, that also appears in this parsha, and that's considered to be a chok, a decree. So let's talk about these three categories and why these three categories are necessary. So I once heard a nice interpretation, and the interpretation goes as follows: that if you think about a human relationship between two people, there has to be, if you want to have a healthy relationships and you want to preserve the relationship, there's really three things you have to do, or the three ways how the relationship is preserved. Number one is you have to have certain things in common. You have to do things that both of you enjoy, okay? So in other words, the relationship has to be satisfying to you. That's one step, one dimension. But if that's all it is, then it's not a relationship. It's a business transaction. It's a win-win. I do for you, you do for me. We're both happy. Everything is fine. It's not a relationship. A relationship also has to have commitment. And commitment means I'm doing something for you, not because I want it. I'm doing it for you. Now, that can't be the entire relationship, because it has to be also meaningful for you. In other words, you have to be able to be enhanced by the relationship. So it's not just devotion, it's also being enhanced. So that's the second rung. So there's certain things that you have to do. In other words, that both of you have to do together as a unit, things that enhance you, that you enjoy. And then there are things that you do not for myself, I do for the other party, because that's what a relationship is. A relationship is the devotion. Now, in addition to those two very important pillars, there's another idea. If you want to enhance the relationship, you have to be able to set times to commemorate and celebrate the relationship. For example, you have to celebrate your anniversary. You can't forget the anniversary, right? What is the anniversary? Anniversary is, you're saying, it's not just an excuse to buy jewelry or to go out for dinner. Anniversary is that you're clearing your calendar so you could set time to feel the relationship in the same intensity as it was in the beginning. And you sort of recreate that bond and recreate that emotion. So those are the three pillars. You do certain things that both of you enjoy, that are going to enhance both of you. Then there are certain things that I'm not doing. I would never do if I'm not in this relationship, because I'm doing it for you and I'm not doing it for me. That's devotion. And that's another element of the relationship. And then there are things that we do to commemorate the great time, the connection that we feel and the connection that was created. And if you want to think about it in simple Hebrew, this is really the three categories of mitzvot. And our relationship with God is multidimensional because it's deep. And then what are these three categories? So there's the Mishpatim, the logical laws. Why do we do it? We do it because God wants them. We also want them. We also understand them. And in that sense, it's a win-win. We both enjoy it. God is happy that we're doing it, and we can appreciate the mitzvah that we're doing. And then there are the things that we do not for ourselves. Why are we doing this? I'm doing it because we're in a relationship. If we were not in a relationship with God, we would never do it. The Talmud says, even though there are many logical people try to explain reasons why we don't mix milk and meat, spiritual reasons or other reasons, but it's clear the Talmud says, if not for the commandment, we would never do it. Nobody would ever think of this idea not to eat milk and meat. So that's just an example, but there are other mitzvot in that category. Why are we doing it? We're doing it specifically for God. We're not doing it for ourselves. We're doing it because we're in a relationship. And in a relationship, you have to do things that are for the other person, because that's devotion. Otherwise, it's just self-serving. Are you in the relationship just for yourself? That's not a relationship. It's just because what you can get out of it. No. So you have to do things that show and express your devotion to the other party. And that's the chukim, that's the decrees, that's the mitzvah that we do not understand. We don't do it because we understand them. even if we find reasons, but that's not why we do it. And finally, we have to celebrate the anniversary. In other words, finally, we have the third category, which is the category of edu, to testimonials, like the holidays. And the purpose of those mitzvot are to say, could we feel what we felt at Sinai? Could we feel what we felt at the moment of liberation? And that is how our relationship with God, works the other way around. Our human relationships, the three dimensions within a human relationship really reflect and express the three dimensions in our relationship with God. And only when it's done in this way is the relationship actually wholesome, because some people just want to be devoted, but that's not a relationship. It's only one rung. Some people say, I just want to do what God wants. I don't want to spend the time trying to understand that which can be understood. Why do I have to really understand all the intricacies of the civil law? Why is that important that the divine logic and my logic sort of align? Why is that important? Because if you're in a relationship, there has to be certain things that you see the same way. That's the bond. That's the spiritual connection. On the other hand, if you just do what makes sense to you, that's also not a relationship. A relationship has the devotion. And if you're not going to take the time to recreate the feelings that you had in the most intense moments of the relationship, then the relationship is not going to be able to be preserved in the same way. And that's why we have anniversaries. And that's also why we celebrate the holidays. So that's the three elements of the human relationship, which reflect the three elements of our relationship with God, which are expressed in the three categories of the commandments. So that's just by way of introduction. Now, one more detail on this, just one more detail on the concept of the civil law, the Torah that can be understood. There is the idea of faith, and there's the idea of knowledge and understanding. And in Judaism, both are important. There's the idea of faith in God. There's the idea that there are certain things that transcend my wisdom. And in most religions, faith is is seen as the highest level of connection. That's faith. But Judaism has a little bit of a different attitude. And that is, while faith is important and faith is the foundation, it's true. But ultimately, if you want the divine, if you want to change and transform the person, then faith itself is not enough. Then you also need logic. Then you need a person to be able to understand and see and understand why he's doing it, because the human being is an intellectual person, intellectual creation, and the emotions follow the heart, follow the mind. So if you really want to change a person, faith doesn't change people. Faith is a declaration. I declare this is the case, but it doesn't really change me internally. If I understand something, that has an internal effect on myself. And there's actually a beautiful interpretation from the Shalah. Shalah was a 16th century Kabbalist, which a lot of the ideas within the Hasidic movement are based on ideas that he taught. His name was Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz. He wrote a book called Shnei Luchot HaBrit, the two tablets of the covenant, and the acronym of Shnei Luchot HaBrit is the Shalah. So the Shalah says like this. Last week, 2 weeks ago, we read about the song of the crossing of the sea. And at the song of the crossing of the sea, one of the most famous verses is Ze Eli v'anvehu. This is my God, and I will beautify him. Elohei Avi, the God of my father, and I will exalt him. That's the verse. So God is my God, and God is also the God of my father. And if he's my God, it's beautiful. And if he's the God of my father, he's exalted. What does that mean? So the way the Shalah teaches is he says like this. The God of your father, the God that your father passed on to you, is the God of faith. That's the faith. You were very young. Your father said, we're going to shul and believe in God. That's faith. And faith is wonderful. The problem is that with faith, Elohei Avi, the God of my father, is exalted. God is removed from you. God doesn't change you. When you say, Ze Eli, this is my God, says the Shalah, my God means I understand him. That's why he's mine, attributed to me. I figured it out. And if your relationship with God is based also not only on the faith you received from your father, but also because of your own understanding, then it's beautiful. Then you become beautiful and you beautify the relationship because now I am changed. And now I understand the importance of this relationship with God. And that's why I don't know that there's another religion that has the civil law of the religion has religious significance. We're going to start reading what to do if I ask you to hold my donkey, or what to do if my ox gores your cow. Okay, so these are very wonderful problems to have, and every system of law defines ways to solve the legal problems between people. But there's no other religion that says, how you deal with the other person is actually divine wisdom. Thank you, Warren, because Warren gave me the whole book about how different cultures view divine law. And Judaism is unique in the sense that we say that the civil law that we discuss in the Talmud is divine, like Rashi says, Ve'ela Mishpatim, just like the 10 Commandments are from Sinai. How you deal with your neighbor and what happens when you have this financial dispute, that is also divine law. And that's why in Judaism, we study the civil law, not just because we need to know what to do, because not everyone is going to be a lawyer, but we need to study what to do. In other words, because we want to understand the values that the Torah wants should govern the behavior between people. Because otherwise, our relationship just touches the aspect of our soul that's related to faith. Going back to the faith discussion. Part of my soul believes, that's one aspect of my soul. But there's a whole part of my personality that is not affected by faith. It's affected by logic. I want to understand, and the understanding is going to lead me to how I feel. And that, we have to connect every part of ourselves to God, including the logic. And that's why we study the Torah, because we want to understand it. That's the value of understanding, even over faith. So that is, again, another introduction. And then once we have all the introductions, or some of the introductions, we could start going into the specifics of the law. And we'll try to do a little bit, again, we always try to do a little bit of the simple meaning and the straightforward meaning, but also on the spiritual meaning that hopefully could be applied to us as well in the modern era. Go ahead, Richard, please.
Yes, regarding logic, everybody's level or understanding of logic is not similar. So some people have a greater understanding of logic to use logic on a higher level. Some people might not have that particular talent. So how does one make both logic and faith work in conjunction when some people have a lesser or a greater degree?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. Everybody has a lesser degree of not only of logic, but also of faith. Some people, faith comes more natural to some people than to others. So different people have different measures. The mix of my soul is different than yours. But it's clear that Judaism would say that everybody has to have a little bit of both. There's a verse, the verse in the prophet says, Da et Elokei avicha. You should know the Lord of your father. In fact, the first, Maimonides defines the mitzvah, the first mitzvah of the Torah, not chronologically, but the most important mitzvah, that when he codifies the commandments in his book of commandments, he classifies the first mitzvah, which is I am the Lord your God, which is the 10 commandments. But if you think about it, I am the Lord your God. What is it? What is that? Is that a commandment or is that a statement? Right? I am the Lord your God. What is that? What is that even saying? So conventionally, people use that mitzvah, they use that commandment to say there is a mitzvah to believe in God. Okay? Maimonides uses that verse and says, no, that's not what it says. It's not what Maimonides says. He says the mitzvah is to know that there is God. In other words, to investigate, to think logically, and to come to the discovery a logical discovery to the existence of God. And Maimonides says that, and the Zohar says that. So what do you see here? You see here that we're not saying we don't need faith. Of course, we have faith, and it's natural to us, and we have to try to cultivate faith. But that's another that is another discussion. That's the premise. And many cultures have, and all religions rely on faith. What's interesting about Judaism is that the intellectual investigation of the existence of God is a commandment. It has religious significance. Not only that, but also our relationship with God. what do we do because of our religion? So what do? Well, we do certain things we do, which we don't understand why we do it. We do it because God commanded, fine, the laws of purity, impurity, etc. But then that's not enough. God is going to say, I need you to understand the logic of how my wisdom affects this physical world. And therefore, in Judaism, everybody is the lawyer. Everybody studies Torah. Everybody studies the law. Even people who have no business or are not interested or don't expect to be lawyers or judges. Why? Because this is the part of Torah that can be understood and can be assimilated within my logic. And what happens when I do that is that the divine wisdom actually becomes part of me. Now my relationship with God is not just impacting the part of myself, which is faith, which is my soul and my subconscious levels, but the relationship with God also touches the very important part of me, which is my logic. And if I would not have logic, if I would not use my logic to connect to God, then a very significant part of me, if not the most significant part of me, would be disconnected from my spiritual, from my religious side, or from my spiritual side. So that's the idea how faith is important, but the understanding and the investigating and the studying and the assimilating God's wisdom into our wisdom, which happens through the mitzvah that we could understand, that is not only a practical way of how to live life in a moral way, but it also has religious significance. Go ahead, Karina, please.
This is a very simple question because I missed something. You said the God of faith, and the other one, what was the one that when I say this is my God?
My God, Ze'eli, that's my God. So the Shabbat says that's the God that I understand.
Okay, but you said you said a specific word about that or not? Like God of faith and the other one? I understand. This is my God.
I don't know what I said, but if I had to say it again, I would say logic, hasaga, logic.
Okay.
Right? I have the God of faith and the God of logic. Which one do I need? I need both. But what's interesting is that the God of faith is exalted. It's not going to change me. It's exalted. I don't remember.
That was the word.
Yeah. So exalted means to uplift him. He's removed from me. He doesn't really change me. I believe, yeah, but it's easy to believe. But when I understand something, that's when it impacts me and changes me internally. Okay, so what did we discuss so far? We discussed why it is that the Torah places these civil laws in conjunction with the revelation at Sinai, where God is making his presence known, which seems to be a very spiritual and religious story. And yet we put in the idea that sort of common sense laws, because that's the purpose. The purpose is that the connection to God permeates every part of our personality. Okay, that's the beginning. Now we could stop. Now we can actually get into the meat and potatoes. So where do we begin with? We begin with the laws of the servants. And basically, you have a Jewish servant. He works for you for 6 years. They translate Eved. Eved could be slave, but it's not really a slave. It's a servant. He works for you for 6 years. And the idea here is you have to send him home on the 7th year. You have to send him free. Problem is, if the person doesn't want to go free, then you have a system where you can keep him, you pierce the ear, which means that it's a ceremony that's supposed to be humiliating. We're not happy that you're not listening to God. You want to be a servant. It's a terrible thing to want to do. But if you want to do it, okay, you can do it. And then you would serve the guy forever. Now, the sages say, forever? Nothing is forever. Nothing is forever. The universe doesn't exist forever. Nothing's forever. So what's forever? Forever, they say, is le'olam, is to the Jubilee, till the 50th year. In biblical Israel, is a 50-year cycle. Every 50 years is a Jubilee. They reset the economy. All land goes back to its previous owner, etc. And one of the ramifications of the Jubilee year is that the servants go free. Okay, so that's the mitzvah. Now we can go into this and there's a lot to say, and we spoke about this in past years, but briefly, what happens? Who can be sold as a servant? So number one, if somebody steals and he cannot repay, so then he's sold as a servant, and what happens is that's how he pays back the money of the theft. So that's the one way you can be sold as a servant. If I steal, that's the only way the court could sell me as a slave, as a servant, if I steal and I can't repay. And the other option, if a person is so poor, and then he could sell himself as a servant, and then Again, at the 60th year, he goes free. Okay, so that's the two categories. Now, modern people don't like to think about servitude or slavery, and we like freedom, and therefore people get very uncomfortable that the Torah at least allows for the laws of some form of slavery or servitude. Call it what you want. And that's why modern people don't like this parsha, and therefore they try to skip the first. I'm only kidding. The rabbis don't like making sermons in the first section of this parsha. It makes people uncomfortable. But I love the beginning of this parsha. I think it's absolutely beautiful, because what is it really telling us? What it's telling us is that society has problems. We have certain people that are going to descend to crime and descend to poverty. Now, how do we solve these problems? So in the modern world, if someone steals, we take him away from society, we put him in prison. And what happens when you put someone in prison with other prisoners? Well, he probably comes out worse, but at least he doesn't come out better. And then you have somebody who's so poor, the person would be potentially homeless. So what do? We try to help them, but we separate them from we separate them from our neighborhood. We don't want the homeless shelter in our neighborhood. In the Torah system, what happens is if someone cannot pay back, someone steals and he cannot pay back, what you have to do for this person is you have to bring him in to a proper home. And therefore, the Torah says the way we're going to solve this problem, both homelessness and theft, person steals, what we're going to do is we're going to find someone who says, you know what, we're going to bring you into our home. We're going to sell you. We're going to help you rehabilitate. And in fact, the problem now the problem the Torah has is the other problem. The problem is the guy's going to get too comfortable. He's not going to want to leave. And that's why the Torah says, oh, no, you can't stay. And if you stay, we're going to pierce your ear. It's a terrible thing. You're violating the 10 Commandments, which says, we'll see the Rashi in a second. There's two problems. The person who stole, you violated the 10 Commandments. And the verse says, the Jewish people are servants to me, and you want to be a servant to another human being. Terrible thing. After the 6 years, no, we can't. We don't want this to continue. But what you see here is that it's so appealing for the servant to want to stay, because finally the servant is living in a nice home, and he's being treated with respect, and he's being rehabilitated. So basically, so I think it's an absolutely beautiful parsha. So in other words, what the takeaway from here is that if you want to solve society's problems, you're not going to solve it by separating the problem from the healthy society. Somehow or another, there has to be some level of integration. I'm not saying I know how to do it, but I'm just saying that's what works. Years and years ago, he's not on the call now, but years and years ago, Steve Dubinsky told me a story. This is a true story, at least, yeah. No, he said like this. He used to be a detective in the Bronx. And there was a big department store, which I forget the name of the department store, but it was owned by a Jew. And one day the police are called and he showed up. And what happens is that there was an African-American kid who stole from the department store. So they called the police. So the police come and they catch this guy and they bring him to the store. And then they asked, I think his name was Mr. Hecht. I remember Hecht because it's my grandmother's name, but they were not related. But in any case, and then the detectives ask this Mr. Hecht. He says, "You want to press charges against this guy?" So he asked the kid, and he says, "Why do you steal?" So he says, "I have no money." So he says, "You know what? I'm going to hire you." And he hired the guy. And Steve tells me that in 2 years he was like the manager of the place. Okay, so I'm not suggesting you don't try this at home. You got to be careful the way you deal with this. But the concept that the way you help somebody is by bringing him into your life. That's something that is very consistent with what the Torah is telling here about the servant, and who's somebody who's really the lowest people in society, someone who's stolen, can't repay, or someone is so poor that they have to sell themselves as a servant. And in that sense, that's the way you create rehabilitation. And like I said, the problem is the guy doesn't want to leave, and that creates other problems because the Torah is very offended when the guy doesn't want to leave. And we actually this is very interesting. The Rebbe explained this. We pierce it. Let's read the piercing of okay, let's read inside. This is too much fun not to read inside. Oh, we hide the Rashi. Okay, so here we go. I have to share it. These are the ordinances that you shall set before them. Should you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall work for 6 years, and in the 7th year, he shall go out to freedom without charge. If he comes in alone, he shall go home alone. He shall go out alone. If he is married man, his wife shall go out with him. Which is, I don't want to get into this. This is even more. His wife was never sold as a slave. What does it mean his wife goes out? But I'll go into it. It's fun. Right? Verse 3 is very tricky. Verse 3, if he comes in alone, in other words, the slave was purchased alone, he shall go out alone. If he is married man, his wife shall go out with him. What does it mean his wife shall go out with him? His wife was never sold as a slave. So the sages say like this: if you buy a servant, if you purchase a servant for 6 years and he's married, then you have to support his wife as well. She's not a servant, but you have to support his wife. After the slave goes free, then the wife goes free too, in the sense that you don't have to support her. So I'm just trying to show what's happening here, how the rehabilitation has been taken to the extreme. Not only are you gonna bring the servant into your home, but you're actually also going to support his family. But in any case, then there's a case if he's not married. The sages say if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. Okay, we're not going to get into this right now. But if the slave says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free, his master shall bring him to the judges, which is to the court. Actually, in Hebrew, it says Ha-Elohim, which could mean the God. Because in this parsha, when you say God, you mean the court, because that the presence of God is in the court. And he shall bring him to the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Again, it's not forever, it's till the 50th year. It's not 50 years, it's till the 50th year. The 50th year could be 49 years away, or it could be 3 years away. It all depends. In any case, says Rashi like this: why are we making a hole in the person's ear? So I'm skipping to the middle of Rashi, because there's a lot to say here. Okay, make it bigger here for people. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan. Now, why was the ear? If you could see, I'm highlighting the beginning here. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, let's go back to the question. Why was the ear? Now, why was the ear chosen to be bored out of all organs of the body? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, the ear that heard on Mount Sinai, you shall not steal, and then went and stole, shall be bored. You make a hole in the ear. And if the text is referring to the one who sold himself into servitude, the reason is that the ear that heard, for the children of Israel are slaves to me, says God, and then went and acquired a master for himself, this ear shall be bored. Okay, what are we doing? We're taking him to the door. I'm basically saying, you can leave. You're free to leave. You don't want to leave, we're offended. Why are we offended? Because you're not listening to God. By accepting to remain a servant, you're not listening to God, either by violating the mitzvah, the theft, or by selling yourself as a slave. So the Rebbe asked a very interesting question. The question was, when did the violation occur? When did this guy steal? Or when did this guy give in his freedom, trade in his freedom for money? 6 years ago when he was sold, not 6 years later when he's going out. So why are you humiliating him on the way out and not on the way in? The violation had happened 6 years earlier. So the Rebbe's interpretation is beautiful and very compassionate. It says we're not going to humiliate him for stealing. Why not? Because maybe he stole because he was hungry. So you're not allowed to steal, but we understand why you're doing it. Maybe you sold yourself as a slave because you had no choice. You were homeless. You couldn't support yourself. Okay, so you descended so low, so you have no choice. Okay, but 6 years later, now you've been rehabilitated. Now, if you choose to stay, that shows that you didn't sell yourself because you were desperate. You didn't steal because you were desperate. You sold yourself, or you stole because you were not sensitive to God's commandment. So the end tells us about the beginning. But when a person just steals, you can't humiliate the person. Maybe he's too poor. When a person is totally impoverished and has to sell himself as a slave, we're not going to humiliate him. If when he has a chance to leave, he doesn't. Now we're offended that you're not sensitive enough to freedom. Okay, so that is the value. That's the story. And unfortunately or unfortunately, the bottom line is these laws don't apply today, not only in the United States of America, but also in Israel. The laws of servitude don't work, because for them to work, you have to have the laws of the Jubilee, and there are no laws of the Jubilee. So none of this is practical in the practical sense. So why are we getting together at 10:42 on Sunday morning and Thursday morning and discussing it? So the first thing is that we want to get what are the values. The values are, if you want to help somebody, don't send them away from society, bring them into society. Okay, fine. But there's also a spiritual counterpart. And the Rebbe explained as follows. He said like this. He says, in some sense, if you think about 6 years you work, and the seventh year you go free. What does that remind you of? It reminds you of the 6 days of the week and the Shabbat. right? So everything in the Torah is 6 and 7. So you have the 6th and the 7th. So you have 6 years of servitude, seventh year you go free. And by the way, when it comes to the Jubilee, there are 6 cycles. I'm sorry, 7 cycles. And then they get the 50th. In any case, when you talk about 6 and 7, it makes you think of the Shabbat. So what's happening? In some sense, we are all in the state of servitude during the 6 days. Because during the 6 days, our soul would rather sit and study Torah all day and be engaged in spirituality all day. But the reality is that we live in the physical world and we have to take care of our physical needs. So for the soul is really in a state of servitude. The soul is forced to do things that it naturally would not want to do for itself. It only has to do it because it's living in this world. And so in some sense, our soul is in slavery or in servitude during the 6 days. But Shabbat comes, Shabbat, we're free. Why? Because the business is closed. We're not engaged in physical matters, or at least to a lesser extent, and we have all the time in the world to devote to spirituality. So it's the same idea. 6 days you go free, and the 7th day you go. 6 days you work. In other words, not just work physically, but your spiritual self, your soul is much more trapped because it's doing things that it would prefer not to do. And the 7th day is the opportunity for the soul to go free. The problem is that sometimes the slavery becomes too comfortable. Comes Shabbat, and instead of devoting time to spirituality, we'd rather worry about what we're worrying about all week. So here the Torah says, when the Torah says, the Torah is sort of upset and calling out in pain. How could this be? It's absurd that on the 6th year, when it comes time to go free, and the servant doesn't want to go free. It's like the Torah is like almost in shock. How could this be? The guy doesn't want to go free. How could it not cherish the opportunity for freedom? So when the Rebbe said this verse, it's really talking to us. Comes Friday afternoon, and we're very comfortable in the slavery. We read these verses, and the verses we hear the judge, the court, God telling us, what does this mean? You have the opportunity to go free. You seize the opportunity and realize that we're a servant to God. We're not a servant to people. We're a servant to God. We're not a servant to the materialism and to the burden of succeeding in the material sense. We're servants all 6 weeks, all 6 days. But on the 7th day, when we go free, we realign our values and we express the fact that ultimately our true self is a servant to God and not a servant to materialism and physicality. So again, this verse can be explained and read also in a way that it's relevant to us in the spiritual sense. So I thought that was beautiful and also relevant because it happens to every Friday. Go ahead, please, Doctor.
In your community, is there a visceral reaction when you see a man who's walking around with a pierced ear?
No, not really. Not really, because again, those laws don't apply. But what the Torah wants you to do, the Torah wants you to have a visceral reaction to somebody who does not cherish the freedom, because freedom is a gift. Freedom has responsibility, and sometimes it's actually much more comfortable to be in servitude.
Well, what you're saying is true, because after the Lincoln freed the slaves, they didn't know what to do with themselves and stayed right there on the plantations.
Right. Well, I don't know enough history, but I would assume that then there were other circumstances that made it more difficult. So I'm not an expert on this. I won't talk about this. But what I would say is the Torah system is that during the 6 weeks, we actually help the servant integrate. We bring them into the family. And what is he taught in the family? He's sitting at the dinner table. What does he hear? What does he experience? What values do he experience? And we hope that is rehabilitating, and hopefully rehabilitating to the extent that when the 7th week comes, when the 7th year comes, he wants to create that for himself. And if he doesn't, then on one hand, we're offended and we're hurt and we say, this is terrible. On the other hand, what are we going to do? We're going to throw him into the street? We can't. So we let him stay. But then it comes the 50th year, the Jubilee. Oh no, the Jubilee is where you read the verse that is inscribed in the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, that you have to pronounce freedom in the entire land. The Jubilee, you're out of the house. You probably also won't be in the streets, because if the Jubilee came, in the system of the Jubilee, you also got a piece of real estate, because all land goes back to the original owner. So ultimately, when we give them freedom, we also give them opportunity. But this is sort of all parts of the puzzle have to be intertwined, have to be present for the system to work. So the system doesn't apply today because the Jubilee doesn't apply today, but the values certainly do apply.
But what happens with recidivism? Where
So
you can't,
hopefully, if when you bring the person into your home, you don't let the person, you're actually teaching the person to live a productive life. So living in your house, so there's a schedule to follow, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully there is rehabilitation. Unlike the current system in America, where the prison system is supposed to be rehabilitating, but all the studies tell you that it's not. But that's because what are you doing? You're putting somebody in an unnatural place in a way that is not, and there's no opportunity to be integrated back into society. Now, again, am I saying I know what to do with serious criminals and how to do this? Of course not. But I'm just saying that Torah also has, if someone is a murderer, they're not going to bring him into, you're not going to bring him into the house. But the opening statement of the 10 Commandments is someone stole, someone has no money, someone stole. What are you going to do with him? You're going to isolate him with other criminals, or you're going to bring him into the house? And what's funny to me is that when you look at the parasha, you say, "Oh, terrible! The Torah is so regressive. It allows for servitude. It allows for slavery." But if you just examine a little bit, scratch beneath the surface, you see that maybe the Torah's perspective is far more open and advanced than what we have. But maybe these are all questions. I don't have all the answers, unfortunately or fortunately. Go ahead, Warren.
Just maybe an observation and a comment. I mean, it seems to me that we look at these rules, we tend to look at these rules, or at least many of them, as in some way unfortunate. And we maybe, and as you say, we ask why, and there often is no answer. But if you look at what's happening in the context of the narrative that's unfolding through the Torah, it's quite possible to look at what is happening here as the receipt of a great gift, because we start out with no law, and we have brothers killing each other. We then move to later on in the evolution in the development of human history, and we have the problems that led to the flood, again lawlessness. And then we move further on, and we have Sodom, and then we move a little bit further, and we have slavery in Egypt.
Right.
And now we reach a point where we receive, where the Jews are given the gift of a body of law, which permits humans to relate to one another in a way that is far more decent than the anarchy, the chaos, and the might makes right that preceded it. So, I mean, am I looking at this in the right way, or am I?
I think you're right. I think anytime that you have a law, it allows for civilization and allows for people to live with each other, and it avoids the chaos of the era of the flood, for example, on one extreme, and Sodom on the other extreme. I agree fully. What I think that from the perspective of Judaism, it's more than that. It's not just utilitarian. It's not just the idea that here we can live and like the Talmud says if there was no law, people would swallow each other alive, right? So it's not just the avoidance of anarchy, but from the perspective of the Torah, there's actually religious value in the civil law of the Torah, because it's also from Sinai. All right, and the Torah and the sages make that point. Ve'ela, and these other ordinances. Usually, most parshas begin, and God spoke to Moses, saying, right. That's when it comes to the law. That's the most famous verse in the Torah. Vayomer Hashem Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moshe. Nothing. It doesn't say God spoke to Moshe. Why? It's trying to say it's a continuation from Sinai. It's divine. It's God's values being implemented in the relationships between people. So I agree with everything you said. I just think that there's probably an additional layer on top of that. I'm just going to take a break for about 30 seconds because I need to plug in. I guess physically, I got to get the wire into the wall, but probably have to plug in spiritually too. But that's another story. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, I think I'm back in business. Okay, go ahead, Vicky.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. That's, fascinating way of looking at the Jewish slave. But I had a question for you in that regard. What if, like the person who takes a slave, he's risking a lot. For example, he has a family, and then here comes the person who not probably the best moral standards, possibly with the wife, possibly with the children. So does anybody talk about it? Like who is influencing who? Is there risk involved that it's going to be negative influence to that person's family?
My guess is there's always risk, but I guess that this guy is in the minority. In other words, this guy he's not coming in with his whole family, right? Just I clarified that when the verse says if he comes with his family, he'll leave with his family. That is the case. That doesn't mean his family moves in. It means that the owner has to support the family. It's clear the Talmud says like this: if you're going to buy a servant, you should know you're not really buying a servant, you're really buying a master. Because that's what it says, because you have responsibility. You know, if you have an employee, right? You know, half your day, if you have an employee, you have responsibilities to the employee. The good news about an employee is that when it comes 5 o'clock, you could send them home, right? When you have an employee, they have to worry about for 24 hours a day. So it's a big pain. The only way it works, the only reason slavery works is because the business model is exploitation, right? But if you're not going to exploit the person and you're going to worry about them for 24 hours a day, it's a big responsibility. And the Talmud goes to the extent you can't give them different food to eat. Whatever you eat, you have to give the person. So the Talmud does say, if you're buying a Jewish servant, you should just know, a Jewish slave, you're just really buying a master. In other words, it's a big burden. So we understand that the person doing so is a person who, on one hand, may benefit in the fact that you have a live-in help, which is a wonderful thing to have if you can get it. But on the other hand, it's obviously a burden, and it's obviously a certain risk and a certain responsibility. And you're doing it because, in a sense, you also contribute. You also believe in the calling to help this person. So I don't know if the financial calculation. I'm not sure your accountant would say this is the greatest of ideas. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. I don't know, but maybe the accountant at least won't disagree and say, okay, I see there's some model here. But the bottom line is that there's probably also a burden involved. It's definitely a burden involved. And if you're doing it, it's because you understand and you appreciate the value.
And as far as influence, it should be calculated risk. So the person should be confident that he is influencing him, not the other way around.
Right. But I think the balance of power in the family, in the area, I think the balance of power is going to be in the sense that the servant probably will be the one influenced. That's my guess.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so a lot of this portion has a civil law, as we said. We talked about the servants a little bit. We didn't do everything, and there's also the idea of damages, torts, and there is the laws of what happens. The 4 categories of torts, which I don't think we're going to get into today, and then we have the laws of the guardians, which the Talmud discusses at great length. And also we don't have that much time left. So I don't know how deep we can get into this, but one point I want to mention is, because we spend so much time in the Talmud talking about the 4 categories of really this. Okay, the civil law in the Talmud is really divided into three sections, 3 Talmudic tractates called Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, Baba Batra, which is first gate, second gate, third gate. Sorry, first gate, middle gate, last gate. First gate, all those, primarily they all come from this parsha. The first gate is really laws of damages, of torts, which comes from this parsha. The 4 primary categories of torts. The middle gate, discusses many things, but also discusses the laws of the guardians, which are mentioned in this parsha. So a lot of, there's almost 3 tractates in the Talmud, a total of probably, I would say 350 pages in the Talmud or more, discussing the matters of this parsha. But I just want to say one word about the guardians, because the guardians we discussed it in the past, but I don't think I ever mentioned this detail. So basically, if I'm going to guard something from you, if you ask me to hold something or borrow something, so there's certain responsibility I have for you to guard this, but there are certain cases when I'm there's certain cases when I am not responsible. Every category, the 4 categories, and again, we don't have time to get into this, but every category has at least one instance where the guardian is not responsible. Okay, it's very nice to know. What's interesting is if you look back to the book of Genesis, and the book of Genesis, there's a guardian. Who is the guardian? Now, you may call it an employee, but he's a guardian. Who's the guardian? Who defines himself as a guardian? He was a guardian for 20 years, and that is Jacob. Jacob works for his father-in-law. He shepherds his father-in-law's sheep, and he gets paid with sheep. Well, first for 14 years, he gets paid with the right to marry his daughters, but that's another story. And the final 6 years, so that's 14 years. In the final 6 years, he's paid with by sheep. And he defines himself as a guardian. I was your guardian, I guarded your sheep. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I heard a rabbi saying it, and it's interesting, that if you really want to look at the conversation between Jacob and his father-in-law Lavan, you will see what the common notion of what a guardian is responsible for. And maybe this parsha is a contrast to what was taking place in Jacob's times, because that's the only record we have in the Torah about a guardian pre the giving of the Torah. So what do you see over there? You see over there that basically the story is that after Jacob escaped from his father-in-law, he ran away because he thought his father-in-law would not let him leave, and he would not let his daughters, which was Jacob's wives, leave. So Jacob runs away. Father-in-law chases him, and when he chases him, they meet up at some place called it's called Mount Gilad, and basically they confront each other. And he says, "Why?" The father-in-law says, "Why did you run away from me?" And Jacob is so upset, and Jacob, because now he searches his hope. Without getting into the stories, Jacob is going to speak how loyal he was to his father-in-law and how his father-in-law did not reciprocate. So I'm reading in in the Stone edition, it's page 167. I'm going to read, so it's Genesis chapter 31. He says as follows. He says like this, 39, page 167, verse 39. 38, we'll read 38. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and she-goats never miscarried, nor did I eat rams of your flock. That which was mangled I never brought you. I myself would bear the loss. From me you would exact it, whether it was stolen by day or stolen by night. And he goes on. How loyal he was. What is he saying? He's saying, I never gave you a bill for an animal that died. No matter how it died, it could have been devoured by a wild animal, by day, by night. Any loss that occurred to these animals, I fit the bill. I did not bill you. What's interesting is, you look at the 4 guardians, there's never a guardian that is responsible for everything. There's always some sort of shared responsibility. Okay? There's always, if I'm going to guard something for you, I have responsibility. I can't be negligent. I'm responsible in the case of theft. And so under certain circumstances, it depends what the guardian is. It depends if I'm paid or unpaid. It all depends. But there's never a case, the way Jacob describes, that the guardian is responsible for everything. In some sense, what this institution of the guardians is doing, it's basically sharing the burden of responsibility between the guardian and the owner. And one way to look at it is that in some cases, the guardian, at least in the case of Jacob, a lot of times the guardian is an employee. The guardian is the person with less power in the relationship. And what the Torah is doing is Torah is sort of leveling the playing field, saying not all the responsibility lays upon the guardian. If he's negligent, certainly, but there's no such thing as one party has all the liability and all the responsibility and the other party's off the hook. In that sense, the Torah is saying that this responsibility is shared. So that I thought is an interesting detail, which we haven't said in the past. There's so much more to say. Like I said, 350 pages in the Talmud. Problem is it's 1103. So God has to give us many long years, and we'll come back and discuss this parsha in good health next year, same time, same place. Could be in Zoom, in person, in Jerusalem, or wherever else you are. And in any case, it should be a wonderful day. And the idea here is that whatever we do, we take the spirit, the values and the spiritual experience of Sinai, the spiritual feeling of a relationship with God, and we understand that our relationship with God expresses itself in how we treat other people. That's really the key takeaway. So have a wonderful day, and we should see each other in good health.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye
Thank
all.
you. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Bye.
you. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
It's interesting.
Thank you.
You made it sound like this was going to be of so interest. And it's a bit of a soap opera.
Oh, so as in said. Okay, yes, that's the
That
challenge.
was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thank you.